Listen. In 1954, a factory worker's wife in Dayton, Ohio, fed her family of 7 on just $9 a week. She made the same 5 casseroles in a relentless rotation and never once heard a complaint from her children or her husband. Her secret: the specific alchemy of stretching a single pound of ground beef across a dozen plates, is number 6 on this list. Number 19 cost less than 40 cents to put on the table and could sit in the heat of a coal-fired oven for over an hour without a soul watching it. Number 3 was the undisputed star of every church potluck, from the red clay of Alabama to the dairy country of Wisconsin, brought by a woman who guarded the recipe like a state secret until the day she was laid to rest in the town cemetery. These 25 casseroles were built for a singular, grueling purpose, stretching almost nothing into a meal that looked like a celebration of plenty. This is the story of the American table before convenience food and frozen dinners buried our history under layers of plastic and preservatives. It is a story of frontier hearths, lumber camp cookery, and the Depression-era resourcefulness that defined the American spirit from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. Before you hear the countdown, hit that subscribe button to keep these forgotten American foodways alive. We are counting down the 25 forgotten poor man casseroles our grandmas swore by. The American casserole was never just a recipe format. It was a mechanical engineering solution to the problem of hunger. In the small-town kitchens of the Midwest and the drafty farmhouses of the Great Plains, a woman serving a boiled potato and a lone fried egg on a chipped plate was serving a portrait of poverty. But that same woman, layering those potatoes with a simple white sauce and a handful of crumbs into a heavy ceramic dish, was serving a supper. The psychology of the dish mattered as much as the calories. It provided dignity to families who were one bad harvest or one factory layoff away from the breadline. These dishes were acts of quiet, fierce resourcefulness performed by women who understood that how food looked on the table affected how a family felt about its place in the world. Whether it was the salt pork and beans of a New England winter or the southern iron skillet classics of the Carolinas, the goal remained the same: unified comfort. Every dish on this list was built on that understanding of the American home. We begin our journey back in time with number 25, the bread and butter casserole. Long before bread pudding was rebranded as an expensive restaurant dessert, it was a savory weeknight staple in the textile mill towns of the South and the industrial hubs of the North. Mothers would take slices of day-old white bread, layer them in a heavily buttered baking dish, and scatter whatever bits of leftover ham or salt pork they had between the layers. They poured a mixture of beaten eggs, milk, and black pepper over the top and baked it until the surface turned a deep golden brown and the center set firm like a savory custard. In 1955, a loaf of bread cost 16 cents and eggs were 60 cents a dozen. This entire dish fed 5 people for under 40 cents. It was the ultimate working mother meal because you could assemble it the night before, meaning supper was ready 45 minutes after you walked through the door from a 10-hour shift. It vanished from American kitchens the moment sliced bread became so cheap that nobody bothered saving the stale ends anymore. Number 24 brings us the biscuit-top beef casserole, a mid-century classic that traded the labor-intensive mashed potato topping of a shepherd's pie for the efficiency of the American biscuit. Ground beef was browned with a single yellow onion and mixed with a can of tomato soup and whatever frozen peas were left in the bag. The genius was the topping: rounds of raw biscuit dough from a 10-cent refrigerated tube. After 30 minutes at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, the biscuits puffed into golden clouds, while the meat bubbled underneath in a rich tomato-based gravy. In 1956, ground beef cost about 43 cents a pound. The whole casserole fed 6 people, and the leftovers reheated perfectly the next day. For children who would normally push away a plate of stewed beef, the biscuits made the meal feel special, almost like a treat. It was a dish that asked almost nothing of a tired mother and gave everything back to a hungry family. Finally, for this chapter, we look at number 23, scalloped cabbage. In the heart of the Midwest, from Iowa to Minnesota, a head of cabbage cost less than a dime and could feed a crowd. Mothers shredded the cabbage thin and layered it with a basic white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, the mother sauce of the American poor. Topped with buttered breadcrumbs and baked until bubbling, the cabbage lost its raw, bitter sharpness and turned silky and sweet. Some families added a few strips of bacon or a handful of grated American cheese, but the plain version was what sustained communities during funeral dinners and church suppers. It was the dish nobody bragged about in the local paper, but it was the one every plate was wiped clean of by the end of the night. A whole casserole cost about 25 cents and stretched across 2 full meals, a testament to the quiet survivalism of the American housewife. To understand the pressure cooker that was the 1950s American kitchen, you have to look past the neon signs of the suburban diners and into the ledger books of the people who actually built this country. In the coal camps of West Virginia or the textile towns of the Carolinas, the American dream was measured in cents per hour and the rising cost of a gallon of milk. When the factory whistle blew in Detroit or the sun went down over a dust-scoured farm in Oklahoma, the woman of the house faced a silent recurring crisis. How to fill 7 stomachs when the grocery money had run dry 3 days before payday. There was a profound, unspoken shame attached to poverty food in a decade that obsessed over progress. You didn't want the neighbors in the next tract house over to know you were stretching a single tin of meat. You didn't want the children to see the worry in your eyes as you checked the pantry for the 3rd time. The casserole was the great American mask. It allowed a mother to take the scraps of a paycheck and the remnants of a garden and forge them into something that looked intentional, something that felt like a choice rather than a desperate necessity. This was the era of cast iron discipline, where a woman's worth was often measured by her ability to turn a 15-cent can of beans into a Sunday standard supper without letting the seams of her struggle show to the world. Continuing our countdown with number 22, the original tuna noodle casserole. This wasn't the soggy gray mess that later became a punchline in 1980s sitcoms. This was a mid-century masterpiece of efficiency. 1955, a can of tuna cost about 29 cents, and it was the only way many families in the landlocked Midwest ever tasted the sea. Mothers would take egg noodles, cooked just shy of tender, and fold them into a mixture of cream of mushroom soup, thinned with a splash of milk. They added a handful of frozen peas for color, a rare luxury, and then came the American signature, a thick layer of crushed potato chips scattered across the top. 15 minutes in a hot oven, and those chips turned into a golden salty crust that provided the essential crunch against the creamy filling. Campbell's printed the recipe on their soup labels, and for a decade, it was the most made meal in America. It was the dish that proved you didn't need a fresh catch to have a sophisticated dinner in a Dayton suburb. We eventually decided it was embarrassing, but we were wrong. It was a lifeline that kept the lights on when the budget was screaming. Number 21, the poor man's lasagna, was a direct rebellion against the high cost of specialty ingredients. In the 1950s, finding ricotta or mozzarella in a small-town grocery store in Kansas or Nebraska was nearly impossible, and even if you found it, the price was a barrier for a working-class household. Instead, American mothers used elbow macaroni, layered with browned ground beef and a tomato sauce thinned with water, to make it go further. The secret was the slices of American cheese layered between the pasta. There was enough liquid in the dish to cook the dry macaroni right in the oven, saving the labor and the fuel of boiling a second pot. Covered tightly with foil and baked for an hour, the macaroni swelled into a tender red-stained mass, while the cheese melted into strings. It wasn't Italian in the slightest. It was American poverty cooking wearing a borrowed name, a way for a family to feel like they were partaking in a modern international trend while sticking to a 60-cent budget. It was the Thursday night savior that kept families full when the grocery envelope was empty. Number 20, the hot dog and bean bake, was the ultimate admission that quantity mattered more than pedigree. In 1954, a pack of hot dogs cost 39 cents and a large can of pork and beans was 15 cents. By slicing those frankfurters into thin coins and stirring them into the beans with a sharp stripe of yellow mustard across the top, a mother could feed a family of 6 for less than the price of a single hamburger at a diner. In the heat of the oven, the hot dogs plumped up, the beans thickened into a rich molasses-colored sauce, and the mustard browned into a tangy crust. Nobody was proud of serving it, and it rarely made it into the fancy, glossy magazines of the era, but it showed up on tables from the Pacific Northwest to the Florida Panhandle. It was the meal that never let a family down, providing the protein and the calories needed for a father heading into a double shift or children playing in the summer heat until the streetlights came on. It was a dish built on the reality of the industrial clock. Number 19, the potato and egg casserole, remains one of the most forgotten relics of the 1950s. This was the meatless Friday staple for Catholic families in cities like Boston and Chicago, and a seasonal necessity for farm families when the hens were laying faster than the eggs could be sold. Sliced boiled potatoes were layered with hard-boiled eggs and smothered in that ubiquitous white sauce of butter, flour, and milk. A dusting of paprika on top was the only decoration. The entire casserole cost under 40 cents and provided a hot, filling, protein-heavy dinner without a single scrap of meat. The potatoes held the heat so well that the dish stayed warm through second and third helpings, ensuring that even the largest families left the table satisfied. It appeared in home economics textbooks as the gold standard for affordable family cooking, yet it has vanished so completely that most people under 50 have never even heard its name. We round out this section with number 18, the macaroni and cheese casserole, the real kind. This wasn't the blue box that would eventually take over the American pantry, and it wasn't the artisan version with 4 imported cheeses. This was the 1950s Sunday standard. Elbow macaroni layered with thick slices of Velveeta and doused in a mixture of milk and beaten eggs. Those eggs were the secret that modern recipes have largely forgotten. They transformed the milk into a rich, savory custard that bound the noodles together so each scoop held its shape on the plate. A box of macaroni was 9 cents, and a block of Velveeta lasted through 3 batches of dinner. This was the star of the church potluck, the comfort food of the Great Depression, and the Saturday night treat all rolled into one. The crackling top layer, where the cheese had browned and turned slightly chewy, was the piece every child in the house fought over. It represented the moment when the pressure of the week finally eased, and for one meal, there was more than enough to go around. The architecture of the American casserole was built on a foundation of cast-iron discipline and the hard-won knowledge of the smokehouse. In an era where a single failed crop or a shortened factory shift could mean the difference between a full belly and a hollow ache, the women of the Great Plains and the industrial North developed a specific kind of culinary survivalism. They learned that fat was a flavor carrier, that a tablespoon of saved bacon grease could lend a smoky, expensive depth to a dish made of nothing but garden onions and field corn. They understood the physics of the oven, how a slow, low heat could transform the toughest cuts of salt pork or the starchiest root vegetables into something tender and yielding. This was the food spine of the nation, a reliance on staples that could survive a winter in a cellar or a year in a tin can. It wasn't about following a glossy recipe from a city magazine. It was about the inventory of the pantry and the stubborn refusal to let a single scrap of nutrition go to waste. In the kitchens of the 1950s, the mock dish and the stretched loaf were not seen as failures of craft, but as triumphs of will. Number 17 on our countdown is the legendary shipwreck casserole, a name that perfectly captured the use-what-you-have philosophy of the American housewife. This dish was a staple in the Great Lakes region and throughout the rural Midwest, appearing in community cookbooks under names like 7-layer dinner or hobo casserole. The construction was a masterclass in efficiency. Raw sliced potatoes went on the bottom, followed by a layer of sliced onion, a pound of browned ground beef, and a can of drained kidney beans. The entire wreck was then smothered in a can of condensed tomato soup and baked for 90 minutes. For a mother in 1954 juggling 4 children and a mounting stack of bills, this was salvation in a 9x13 pan. The potatoes steamed in the juices of the beef and soup, the beans provided a cheap protein stretch, and the result was a thick, savory gravy that tied the disparate layers into a unified, hearty meal. It required no pre-cooking beyond browning the meat, allowing the oven to do the heavy lifting while the chores of the day were finished. Moving to number 16, we find the Spam and Rice Casserole. Before Spam became a punchline for late-night comedians, it was a literal lifeline for American families. In the suburbs of the 1950s, military families who had developed a taste for the canned ham during the war brought this recipe into civilian life. Now, cubed Spam was folded into cooked white rice with a can of cream of chicken soup and a handful of frozen peas. The signature American touch was the topping, crushed cornflakes mixed with a pat of melted butter. When baked for 30 minutes, the Spam provided a salty, meaty backbone to the bland rice, while the cornflakes added a buttery crunch that children would scrape off and eat first. Because Spam could sit in a kitchen cupboard for years without refrigeration, it was the ultimate pantry protein for families living miles from the nearest grocery store in states like Montana or Wyoming. There was no shame in a Spam casserole in 1955. There was only a full table and a pan wiped clean with a crust of bread, Number 15 takes us to the coast with the salmon and noodle bake. In the 1950s, a tall can of pink salmon cost about 25 cents, making it a frequent guest on the tables of Catholic families on Fridays, or any household where the budget was being squeezed tight. Mothers would drain the fish and, in a move of pure calculated resourcefulness, crush the soft bones back into the meat with a fork, because they knew it was pure calcium and far too valuable to throw away. The salmon was folded with wide egg noodles and a can of cream of celery soup, topped with plain breadcrumbs, and baked until the edges bubbled. It offered a nutrition-dense, high-protein meal that felt vastly more expensive than it actually was. As canned tuna became cheaper in the following decade, the salmon bake began to fade from the American rotation, taking with it a specific kind of coastal kitchen wisdom. Number 14 was the hamburger and corn casserole, a dish that appeared on Wednesday nights with the regularity of the evening news. This was a simple marriage of browned ground beef, a can of whole kernel corn, cream of mushroom soup, and cooked egg noodles. The corn added a sweetness that balanced the savory beef, and the noodles stretched the meat to feed a family of 6 for less than 70 cents. It was the definition of comfort food, unpretentious, filling, and reliable. Children across the country didn't know they were eating a budget meal designed to last until the next paycheck. They just knew it was their favorite supper. And then there was number 13, the mock chicken casserole, perhaps the ultimate trick of the mid-century kitchen. Using a 19-cent box of saltine crackers, a can of soup, and a beaten egg, mothers would create a firm, sliceable loaf that, when smothered in chicken gravy, genuinely tasted like the real thing to exhausted taste buds on a Thursday night. There wasn't a single shred of poultry in the dish, but the secret held for decades in households from Ohio to Virginia. We close this chapter with number 12, the cheesy potato casserole. Known in many parts of the country as funeral potatoes, this dish was the backbone of community support from 1958 onward. Sliced raw potatoes were layered with onions and generous handfuls of grated American cheese, covered in milk, and baked low and slow for 90 minutes. A 5-pound bag of potatoes cost 29 cents, and the resulting dish could serve 8 people easily. It showed up at every Thanksgiving alongside the turkey and every post-funeral gathering across the Heartland. It was the dish women made when they wanted to show they cared without spending a fortune, a slow-baked testament to the fact that the simplest ingredients, potatoes, cheese, and time, could create a legacy that lasted long after the convenience food revolution tried to erase it. When we look back at the culinary history of the United States, we often find ourselves reading the glossy records left behind by corporate test kitchens and national brands. We see the colorful advertisements for General Mills or Kraft, claiming they invented the convenience of the American home. But the real record is not found in a marketing archive in Chicago or Minneapolis. It is found in the grease-stained, spiral-bound community cookbooks sold at church bazaars in Georgia or VFW halls in Ohio. These were the true records of the American table, the names of women like Margaret or Betty or Ruth, handwritten next to a recipe for that potato thing or Tuesday's surprise. These women were the unsung architects of our foodways, the ones who did the hard math of survival every single morning before the sun hit the barn roof or the factory floor. They were the ones who realized that if you took a single cup of uncooked rice and a can of tomatoes, you could make something that felt like a feast. Their names were often erased by the very companies that eventually sold their ingenuity back to them in a box. But the memory remains in the steam rising from a cracked stoneware dish in a kitchen lit by the soft glow of a single overhead bulb. These recipes weren't just instructions. They were survival logs from the front lines of the American economy. Number 11 on our countdown is the tomato and rice bake, a masterpiece of minimalism that could be found on both rural farm tables and in cramped city apartments. It required only a cup of uncooked rice, a can of tomatoes, a sliced onion, and the most important ingredient in the American pantry, a single tablespoon of saved bacon grease. Everything went into a covered dish and baked for an hour until the rice absorbed every drop of liquid and turned tender and stained a deep, rich red. The bacon grease was the magic, providing a smoky depth that made these incredibly simple ingredients taste deliberate and expensive. This was a meatless casserole that never apologized for its lack of protein. It was filling, savory, and cost less than 20 cents to produce. Farm wives in the Midwest made it when the garden was producing tomatoes faster than the family could eat them. while city wives in the industrial North relied on it when the paycheck ran short. It was a dish that asked for nothing and gave back the warmth and security of a hot meal. Number 10, the chicken and biscuit bake, represents a shift in the American landscape. By 1958, nearly a third of married women in the United States worked outside the home, a cultural shift that demanded a new kind of speed in the kitchen. This casserole was the answer to the question of how to feed a family well on a strictly limited clock. Canned chicken, a can of mixed vegetables, and cream of chicken soup were stirred together and topped with biscuit dough, either homemade or, increasingly, from a 10-cent refrigerated tube. It was baked until the biscuits rose tall and golden, with the filling bubbling up around the edges like a rustic cobbler. It offered all the satisfaction of a traditional chicken pot pie, without any of the time-consuming labor of rolling or crimping a crust. It was a dish born of necessity, allowing mothers to bridge the gap between their new roles in the workforce and their traditional roles at the dinner table, ensuring that even on the busiest nights, the family felt cared for. Number 9 brings us back to the basics with the ground beef and potato layer bake. This was the quintessential unnamed casserole that existed in almost every household from the Pacific Northwest to the Atlantic coast. Raw sliced potatoes formed the foundation, topped with browned, seasoned beef and a layer of sliced onions. A can of tomato soup thinned with water was poured over the top before the dish was sealed with foil and sent into the oven for an hour. The physics of the dish were perfect. The potatoes steamed in the tomato liquid, the beef released its juices downward to season the starch, and the onions softened into sweet, translucent rings. When that foil was finally pulled back, the kitchen filled with a heavy, savory steam that acted as a dinner bell, bringing children to the table without a word being spoken. It cost less than 60 cents, and rarely had a formal name in the family recipe box. It was simply the casserole, a reliable Tuesday night anchor that never let anyone down. Number 8, the sausage and sauerkraut bake, was a tribute to the German-American heritage that shaped the foodways of states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Smoked sausage links were nestled into a bed of drained sauerkraut, topped with sliced apples and a sprinkle of brown sugar. As it baked, the sauerkraut mellowed, losing its aggressive vinegar tang and turning almost sweet alongside the fruit, while the sausage released its smoky fat into the kraut. A can of sauerkraut cost a dime, making this one of the most cost-effective ways to deliver a complex, three-dimensional flavor profile to the table. It was an entire dinner, protein, vegetable, and fruit, in a single dish that required no skill beyond basic slicing. Finally, for this section's number 7 is the chili mac casserole. This was the dish that American teenagers in the 1950s and 60s came home hoping to smell. Browned ground beef seasoned with chili powder was mixed with elbow macaroni, canned tomatoes, and kidney beans, then topped with a layer of grated cheese. The chili powder turned ordinary staples into something exciting and modern, and the cheese pulled into long, satisfying strings with every scoop. It was a dish that survived the convenience food era because it was simply too good to forget, a recipe that children took with them when they moved away to start their own American homes. Listen, there is a specific kind of silence that falls over an American dinner table when the food is finally right. It isn't the silence of loneliness or the quiet of a house where people have nothing to say to one another. It is the silence of deep, bone-deep satisfaction, the sound of 4 or 5 children with their heads down, not arguing over chores or competing for attention, just eating because the food is hot, the gravy is thick, and for the first time all day, there is enough of everything to go around. For a mother who spent her daylight hours scrubbing floors, sewing clothes, or stretching a factory paycheck until it screamed, that silence was the highest compliment she could ever receive. The casserole didn't ask to be admired for its plating or its pedigree. It simply asked to be eaten. It was a humble, steaming proof of love in a 9 by 13-inch world. Every dish on this list was an act of quiet resourcefulness performed by women who understood that a full stomach was the first step toward a dignified life. We have arrived at the top of our countdown, the dishes that defined the survival and the soul of the American working class, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Number 6 is the secret weapon of that factory worker's wife in Dayton, Ohio, the cracker casserole. It was a dish born of the absolute end of the pantry. She would take a sleeve of saltine crackers, which cost 19 cents and lasted forever, and layer them in a buttered baking dish with browned ground beef, cooked onions, and cream of mushroom soup. She would add another layer of crackers, Pour milk over the top to soak the starch, and bake it until the surface crisped, while the crackers beneath swelled into a texture somewhere between a savory dumpling and a Thanksgiving stuffing. 7 children ate this every Monday night for 12 years, and in the steam of a Dayton winter, it was the only thing that made the world feel warm. It was a dish passed down through generations of American women, a hidden lineage of resourcefulness that never made it into a glossy magazine but never left a stomach empty. Number 5, the cabbage roll casserole, was the lazy savior of the industrial North. Traditional cabbage rolls required blanching individual leaves and carefully wrapping a filling, a process that took an hour before the dish even touched the oven. But for the Polish and Slavic grandmothers in the steel towns of Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Chicago, time was a luxury they didn't have. They shredded the raw cabbage, layered it with ground beef, cooked rice, onions, and tomato sauce, and let the oven do the 90-minute labor. The result was a dish that tasted identical to the proper tradition, but allowed a mother to finish the laundry while supper cooked itself. It was the casserole that admitted a shortcut could sometimes be a stroke of genius. Number 4, the hash brown casserole, is perhaps the most emotionally resonant dish on this list. Known across the Heartland as funeral potatoes, this mixture of frozen hash browns, sour cream, onion, and cheddar cheese, topped with buttery crushed cornflakes, appeared at every post-funeral gathering and church supper from 1958 onward. If someone in a small town was hurting, this casserole was already on its way to their door. It was the flavor of community support, a dish that said, "We are here," when words weren't enough. Number 3 takes us to the quintessential American Sunday. The chicken and rice casserole was served in every school cafeteria, church basement, and farmhouse kitchen from Georgia to Iowa. It required almost no preparation. 1 cup of uncooked rice, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and a few chicken thighs, which cost a mere 15 cents a pound in 1955. A packet of dried onion soup mix was sprinkled over the top before the dish was sealed with foil and baked for 90 minutes. The rice absorbed the chicken drippings and the soup, turning into a rich, savory bed for the meat. It fed a family of 8 for pennies and left the pan so clean it barely needed scrubbing. Number 2, the tamale pie, was a beautiful example of how American foodways traveled and transformed. Anglo families in Texas learned the flavors of chili powder, cumin, and corn from their Mexican neighbors and brought them home to Ohio, Virginia, and Maine. By topping a rich, spicy beef and corn filling with a thick layer of cornbread batter, they created a meal that tasted like a roadside cantina, but worked with the staples of a northern pantry. It delivered more flavor for 65 cents than almost anything else on the weekly rotation. And finally, number 1, the tater tot casserole. This is the dish that defined a generation of American weeknight cooking. Ground beef, cream of mushroom soup, and a layer of green beans were topped with a single layer of frozen tater tots lined up like soldiers across the surface. At 375 degrees, the tots turned into a golden, crunchy armor for the creamy beef beneath. It was the most satisfying dollar a mother could spend, a meal that quieted the kitchen and proved that a family could eat like kings on almost nothing. These episodes compressed decades of complex history into minutes, but the legacy of the women who built these tables is timeless. Drop which one you are making in the comments. I want to know if the tater tot casserole gets more love than the tamale pie.